cut the music. Yeah, we had the music.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Vince Cable.
Thank you. It's with a very real sense of pride that I stand before you as leader of the Liberal Democrats. But first of all, I'd like to record my thanks to my predecessor, Tim Farron. He hands over a party which is larger and stronger and more diverse than the one he inherited. And he stood up for refugees whose plight the government had shamefully ignored. And he established our very clear identity as the only real, undiluted, pro-European party. We're all hugely indebted to him. It's good today to be amongst friends, so please forgive me if I start by addressing people who are not yet our friends, but whom we might persuade. People who say they don't know what we stand for, or think we're irrelevant. But anybody who doubts the relevance of the Liberal Democrats should reflect on the three great disasters perpetrated by the two main parties in recent years: the war in Iraq, the banking crisis, and now Brexit. You may remember that the Labour government, egged on, of course, by the Conservative opposition, plunged this country into a disastrous illegal war, and it's helped to fuel the jihadist movement which terrorized the Middle East and our own country and our allies to this day. And it was only the Liberal Democrats under Charles Kennedy who showed sound judgment and political courage when it was needed. And I am immensely proud to have served my parliamentary apprenticeship in that company. And then the same government lost control of the economy. It allowed reckless and greedy bankers to run amok. And yet again, the Conservatives egged Labour on, demanding even less restraint. The Liberal Democrats warned that it would end badly, and it did. An economy built on banking and property speculation was left dangerously exposed to the global financial crisis. And the baleful consequences are with us to this day. Our economy continues to be dependent on the life support system of ultra-cheap money, which even now is inflating a new credit bubble, and it left a real sense of resentment that wealth inequalities have widened and only the super-rich have flourished in this post-crisis world. Now, in 2010, after all that, we could have stood aside, washing our hands of responsibility. We could have been the party that said, yeah, we told you so, but we didn't. We went into government in the national interest to repair the damage. It was the right thing to do, and Nick Clegg led us courageously in doing it. And while thinking about Nick, I know you'll all want to join me in sending to him and to Miriam our collective best wishes as Antonio and the whole family emerge from what has been a very tough and anxious times. Our thoughts are very much with them. Now, Nick has been much vilified by our opponents. But we're proud of him and his record, and I'm certain that just as Parliament now misses his voice, history will vindicate his judgment. You need only to look at our record to know it. In government, we did a lot of good, and we stopped a lot of bad. Don't let the Tories tell you that they lifted millions of low earners out of income tax, because we did. And don't let the Tories tell you that they launched an apprenticeship revolution and industrial strategy, because we did. And don't let the Tories tell you that they brought in the pupil premium and free school meals. We did that. The Liberal Democrats did that. But we have paid a high political price. Trust was lost, and for many voters, we still have to scrub ourselves hard to get rid of the smell of clearing up other people's mess. And now another disaster looms, Brexit. It's the product of a fraudulent and frivolous campaign led by two groups of silly public school boys reliving their dormitory pillow fights. And now, thanks to Boris Johnson, they've degenerated into a full-scale school riot with the head teacher hiding, barricaded in her office. But in the real world, we've yet to experience the full impact of leaving Europe. But we've had a taste of what's to come in the fall in the value of the pound. Now, foreign exchange dealers are not point-scoring politicians. They make cool, hard, unsentimental judgments. Quite simply, that Brexit Britain will be poorer and weaker than if we decided to stay in Europe. Brexit was described by the Brexit Secretary himself as an operation of such technical complexity that it makes the moon landing look simple. And I have to say it's a pity that the Brexit landing is being managed by people who would struggle to get their heads around a toddler's Lego set. These are people who still live in a world of infantile fairy stories. I'm sure you know the one about the giant tweeter. Lives in a White House far away and flies across the ocean to rescue us from the wicked gnomes of Europe. But to be serious for a moment, it's both extraordinary and unforgivable that the government is entrusting the future of this country, its trade policy, its security, its standing in the world, to a special relationship with a president who is volatile and dangerous and an apologist for religious and racial hatred. And it's an outrage that this man, who now presumes to attack our highly effective police and security services, has been invited here on a state visit. As Joe Swinson so rightly said on Sunday, no red carpet for President Trump, the visit should be cancelled. But let me say a few words about Labour. Many people got behind Jeremy Corbyn in June, I think genuinely expecting a better politics and a better future. And they're already being betrayed, because today's Labour Party isn't into problem solving, let alone governing. Jeremy Corbyn's acolytes are focused on how to maximise the contradictions of capitalism. You don't qualify for the Labour shadow cabinet these days unless you've studied the Venezuelan guide on how to bankrupt a rich country. It's actually no wonder they back Brexit. It's no wonder they lined up behind Theresa May, maximising the chances of chaos and disruption. And then a few weeks ago, the moderates briefly penetrated the Corbyn bunker. They persuaded him that collaborating quite so closely with the class enemy didn't look too good. So they've got a new policy, which is to stay in the single market and customs union, possibly, or to leave, maybe. Or maybe stay in a bit and then leave. But I'm trying to be kind. I'm trying to understand what they're trying to say. I think the current line is we should transition to the transition gradually while we prepare for a post-transition world. I think this is what they mean by the smack of firm leadership. But I believe Jeremy Corbyn would do a lot better to get off the fence and refurbish his revolutionary credentials. So, Jeremy, join us in the anti-Brexit People's Liberation Front. I think what the people want, what our country now desperately needs, is some political adults. And that's you. That's us. Unfortunately, we're not alone. There are plenty of sensible grown-ups in the Conservative Party and the Labour Party and the Greens. And beyond them, there are millions of people who are deeply worried about what's happening. And we've got to put aside tribal differences and work alongside like-minded people to keep the single market and the customs union, which is so essential for trade and jobs, Europe's high environmental and social standards, the shared research, the help for our poorer regions, cooperation over policing and terrorism. Now, Europe, of course, needs reform, but you don't achieve reform by walking away. So, our position is clear. The Liberal Democrats are the party of Remain. The government, meanwhile, is stuck in divorce negotiation for which it's hopelessly ill-equipped, it's ill-prepared, and it's internally divided. So I have some practical advice for Theresa May. Take the issue of European Union nationals in the UK and the British nationals in Europe out of these negotiations, because using them as bargaining chips is not only morally wrong, but it's utterly counterproductive. So put the lives of 4 million people first, not the posturing internal politics of the Conservative Party. No ifs, no buts. The government should declare a right to stay now. And at the end of these tortuous divorce negotiations, the British public must be given a vote on the outcome. And let me be clear about this. This is not a call for a rerun. It is not a call for a second referendum on Brexit. This is a call for a first referendum on the facts. When we know what Brexit means, the people should get the choice: the government deal or an exit from Brexit. We know, of course, that our call will be resented by the Brexit fundamentalists. We'll be denounced as traitors and saboteurs. I'm half prepared for a spell in a cell with Supreme Court judges and Gina Miller and Ken Clarke and the governors of the BBC. But if the definition of sabotage is fighting to protect British jobs and public services and the environment and civil liberties, then I am a proud saboteur. Now, the Brexiteers will say, you know, we've already voted to leave. How dare you lot flout democracy? But it's actually quite difficult to follow their argument. It seems to go that consulting the public, having a vote, is undemocratic. Why? What are they afraid of? Are they afraid that those claims about 350 million a week for the NHS won't wash anymore? That claim has rightly been dismissed in the last few days by the independent UK Statistical Authority. So no wonder, you know, Boris and the Brexiteers are so frightened of the people and the facts. They now believe in the slogan of dictators everywhere: one person, one vote, once. I'm a grandparent, and I'm concerned about the country my grandchildren will inherit. And I'm already getting a colourful correspondence from many people of my own generation claiming I've betrayed them, that I've given up too easily on reinventing the British Empire and on the dream of a Britain without foreigners. And I'm still struggling, actually, to think of an answer to a woman who challenged me in all seriousness in a question and answer session in a Wiltshire village. She asked me how we will cope with the arrival of 60 million Turks. Now, I do recognize that the true believers in Brexit are honest enough to admit that it will make us poorer. And there is a word for that: masochism. It isn't illegal. I'm told some people pay good money to indulge in it. But unlike masochists, the Brexit ideologues usually envisage somebody else bearing the pain. And that pain will mainly be felt by young people who overwhelmingly voted to remain. But this argument can't go on forever. Once the issue is resolved by a vote on the facts, we must then try to unite a very divided country around the outcome. So yes, I want our party to lead the fight against Brexit, but we should not be consumed by Brexit to the exclusion of everything else. We're not a single-issue party. We're not UKIP in reverse. I see our future as a party of government. Our party is not just a coalition partner of the past. We're the government of the future. And my role as your leader is to be a credible potential Prime Minister. Now, I know some of you are thinking, looking at the alternatives, that the bar isn't very high. But Theresa May is giving us a very compelling display of weak and wobbly government, divided, dysfunctional, dependent on the Democratic Unionist Party. And we all know that her colleagues want to sack her, bring in somebody more attuned to the challenges of modernity, I guess that's why a current leading candidate for succession, according to the bookmakers, is Jacob Rees-Mogg. on a dream ticket with his nanny. And then we have the Labour Party. I do have one great advantage over Jeremy Corbyn. I have a great team. Our shadow cabinet has 10 former ministers, 3 of whom served in the cabinet. And I'm proud that one of them is our superb new deputy leader, Joe Swinson. My team has been blooded in the difficult business of government. By contrast, in a parliamentary party of 262 MPs, Jeremy Corbyn can find only 2 people who've been anywhere near a cabinet to serve in his alternative administration. All the other plausible candidates for office have walked out or been thrown out. And the question now presents itself, what would they actually do in power? What would a Corbyn government look like? Because their basic appeal is to offer something for nothing, all paid by somebody else. Somebody put it, for them, budgeting is just a bourgeois hobby. I first encountered this politics of free things as a young Treasury official in Kenya. President Kenyatta, the father, faced defeat in an election against an opposition offering lots of freebies. It was, I think, then free food, free land, free cows, free cars. And he turned to my department for help. And we came up with a winning slogan, Hapana chakula kabisa. Roughly translated, that's no such thing as a free lunch. Unless, of course, it's a Lib Dem free school lunch. But money and priorities define the crucial difference between us and Labour. We understand that to govern is to choose, and they don't. And that's why only we are honest with people about the service which everyone in this country cares about, and which Labour always claims to champion, the NHS. If we want a decent service, we've all got to pay for it. And for starters, Liberal Democrats will continue to argue for another penny in the pound on income tax to pay for it. And that means more than $6 billion extra each year for the NHS and social care, and the funding we need for our priority, which is proper care for those suffering mental illness. And my thanks to Norman Lamb for all the phenomenal work he did in that area. So if you want a real champion for Britain's NHS, the Liberal Democrats are the party for you. Now, the attraction of the Labour campaign, however, was that it offered hope. And hope counters despair. Hope can inspire. Hope can achieve change. But what hope cannot do is to make 2 and 2 equal to 7. What the country needs is hope and realism. And in a country increasingly dominated by extremists and ideologues, I want us to fill the huge gap in the centre of British politics. Liberal Democrats have always grappled with the big challenges facing our country and the world, and I'm determined that to meet them, our party will once again become a workshop for new ideas. But hope and realism starts with the economy. Because without a successful economy, you don't have the resources to fix an overstretched NHS and underfunded schools and understaffed police forces and the perilously overcrowded prisons. We currently have a low productivity, low wage economy lagging well behind Germany. And while France is modernizing, Britain is lurching down a nostalgic cul-de-sac of Brexit. And Britain's strengths, and there are real considerable strengths in our country, the openness to trade, to people, ideas, world-class universities and inventiveness, all these things have been put at risk. What the country needs, more investment, more innovation, more training and retraining, more patient long-term capital, the renaissance of manufacturing, the nurturing of creative industries, the greening of the economy. And to achieve these things requires overcoming the petty tribalism and short-termism which are the bane of British politics. Now, we made some progress under the coalition when we launched and pursued the industrial strategy, working with both sides of industry, management and workers. And I also drew on the legacy of political opponents, Labour and Conservative, because the test should always be not who said it, but what works best. Sometimes the state, sometimes private enterprise, but usually a practical combination of the two. Long-term thinking means, above all, having an understanding of sustainability and climate change. And it's very striking that the most fervent apostles of Brexit are also climate change deniers. It's striking, but it's not surprising, because climate change doesn't respect national frontiers and national sovereignty. And I have to say, I think it's tragic that Ed Davies' sterling achievement in the coalition is now being trashed by Conservative ministers who revel in anti-scientific ignorance. It's utterly galling to see the sell-off of the Green Investment Bank to a private sector asset stripper, to see the Green Deal ditched, the Swansea Lagoon delayed, carbon capture and storage abandoned, to see the Conservatives doing a massive U-turn on Heathrow expansion. The Conservatives describe protecting the environment as green crap. By contrast, the Liberal Democrats will always fight for the green agenda. More than anything else, investing in people is the key to a successful modern economy. And our country is fortunate to have excellent universities, many of them world-class, but only a minority, and generally a better-off minority, go to university. As a country, we've systematically undervalued and disrespected the 60% of young people who don't go to university, and the 80% of adults who never went. And that's why I've been working with the National Union of Students on a program to help all young people. Many will go into further and vocational education. But Britain's record in technical education and training so far is absolutely woeful, which is why we now have a chronic skills shortage. And that's why in government, the Liberal Democrats launched an apprenticeship revolution. We made a lot of progress, but there's so much more to do to ensure that high-quality apprenticeships and training are an option available to every young person. I hope you'll indulge me if I explain a bit of family history, which shows why I care passionately about this subject. Both my parents left school at 15 to work in factories in York. Then my father went to night school and he qualified to teach building trades at a further education college. He and I fell out over his right-wing politics, but I never lost my admiration and respect for his life's work with skilled workers, technicians, craftsmen, people that we now desperately lack. And my mother's experience makes the same point in a different way. She discovered night school after a prolonged period of mental illness when I was a child. And she discovered education as an adult, and it helped her to recover. And I was able to apply that experience in government. Alongside Norman Lamb, we were able to secure some funding to reintroduce classes in adult college for those suffering mental illness, and it has been a great success. But the bigger point is the value for everyone of continued adult learning. And millions of workers in middle age now face their office and factory jobs disappearing with the advance of automation and artificial intelligence. And we've got to be the party with answers for those people. One idea I want to develop with you, with the party, is to find a way to support all young people and disadvantaged adults with an endowment or learning account, which they can use at any stage of life, helping to finance further or higher education at post-18 stage or later. It's a fundamentally liberal idea. It's handing over control to the individual. And I want to explore how it can be sustainably financed through the fair taxation of wealth. So under my leadership, our party will be the champions of lifelong learning, giving everybody a chance of self-improvement and employment at every stage in life. But we can't effectively modernize our economy until we radically reform finance. We've got global banks that have little interest in promoting British business and local economies. We've got obsessively short-term capital markets that have the collective attention span of a goldfish. And we've got banks that will only lend when secured against property, to people who want to buy houses, but not to businesses who want to build them, to real estate speculators, but not to exporters and innovators. Liberal Democrats want to see financiers be the servants of Britain's real economy rather than its masters. We did a lot in coalition to improve things, establishing the British Business Bank, the Green Investment Bank, the Business Growth Fund for Risk Capital, splitting the casinos from conventional banking, promoting a culture of long-termism, opening up the market to challenger banks. But that's just the beginning of what is needed to lift Britain from what is at present a dangerous overdependence on property markets and banks in the southeast corner of England. Public investment complements private investment. And this country needs a massive injection of public investment in the railway network, across the north of England and the Midlands, to Wales and the southwest, in broadband, in housing. And every pound spent building modern Britain will be returned many times over. As it happens, never in British economic history has it been cheaper for a bold, active government to borrow for productive investment alongside the private sector. So we have to ask, why is this government so feeble and so passive? I want our party to be pro-business and pro-enterprise. British business right now is in desperate need of a champion, and we will be that champion. Not for the sake of it, but because Britain succeeds when they succeed. Growing numbers have given up on the Tory party because they know it's abandoned British business. And their home is now with us. Progressive firms know, too, that being pro-business doesn't mean being anti-worker. I spent 5 years in government with my colleagues, fighting off Conservative plans to introduce fire at will and to abolish the right to strike. So we're pro-business, but we're also pro-worker. And because we believe in competitive markets and the rights of consumers, it's time to challenge the abuse of corporate power. We take the communications and technology companies. They've got access to vast amounts of personal data and information to use and abuse. And it's no coincidence that the only body strong enough to stand up to them, to Microsoft and Google and Amazon and Facebook, the only body is the European Commission. And does anybody seriously believe that a post-Brexit British government will do anything other than roll over when the big boys come in looking for favors and dodging taxes at will? Now, as some of you know, I've had occasional disagreements with Mr. Rupert Murdoch. But not always, he's sometimes right. He is, for example, reported to have said, when I'm in Brussels, they tell me what to do, and when I'm in Downing Street, I tell them what to do. He got it in one. And as he knows all too well, wealth and power feed off each other, and so do powerlessness and poverty. If there is any single lesson from the Grenfell disaster, is that people in poverty aren't listened to. And nowhere is inequality more marked than in the housing market. Property wealth for the fortunate coexists with growing insecurity and homelessness for many others. Home ownership, which spread wealth for generations, is no longer a realistic prospect for younger people with moderate means. And to put this right, we've got to end the stranglehold of oligarchs and speculators in our housing market. I want to see fierce tax penalties on the acquisition of property for investment purposes by overseas residents. And I want to see rural communities protected from the blight of absentee second home ownership, which devastates local economies and pushes young people away from the places where they grew up. Homes are to be lived in. They're not pieces on a monopoly board. But whatever we do with existing homes will not be enough. A doubling of annual housing supply to buy and rent is needed. And for years, politicians have waffled about house building while tinkering at the edges of the market. And I want to recapture the pioneering spirit that in the mid-20th century brought about developments like Milton Keynes and the new towns. I want to see a new generation of garden cities and garden villages springing up in places where demand presently grossly outstrips supply. But we know that private developers alone will not make this happen. So just as social reformers in the 50s and 60s saw government roll up its sleeves and get involved with building, government today has a responsibility to be bold, to build more of the homes we need for the 21st century. It is absolutely absurd that councils are currently allowed to borrow to speculate in commercial property, but they stop from borrowing to build affordable council houses. This triumph of ideological dogma over common sense must stop. So the government must take the lead and get building. The housing crisis is at the heart of a growing and deeply corrosive inequality between generations. Now, elderly people, of course, deserve respect. Some people have even accused me of being one of them. But the state pension, thanks to the coalition, has rightly been protected. But meanwhile, young people face employment that is insecure and unaffordable housing. And now they have a future of narrowing horizons and closing frontiers, which the vast majority of under 25s never voted for. So as Britain's government of the future, I want Liberal Democrats always to be their voice and their champion. But as we all know, there's an elephant in the room: debt, and specifically student debt. And we all know that we've suffered grievous political harm from making a pledge 7 years ago on tuition fees that we couldn't meet. And the problem hasn't gone away. We are still faced with a fundamental dilemma. The changes we made in government ensured universities are properly funded. And it's also right that the most highly paid graduates should pay the most, and those who earn least pay nothing at all. Yet because the system operates like a tax, we can't escape the fact that it isn't seen as one. And the worry about debt does cause students and their families real concern, and escalating student loan interest rates have added to that concern. And in addition, many universities are obsessed with getting bums on seats rather than giving students value for money. So I've therefore launched a review led by former Cambridge MP David Howarth, which will recommend options for reform, including a graduate tax. And we'll consult on the outcome through the party's policy process, and I aim for the results to come before you at a future conference. But we value the support of students, so we've got to get this issue right. We also know that the most pressing issue for students day to day, and the main source of debt actually, is the cost of living. Under our government, the number of students from poorer households actually increased, in part because Liberal Democrats improved maintenance grants. The government, the Tories, have now trashed that record by slashing those grants altogether. And they should be ashamed to see any student deciding to terminate their studies because they cannot pay the rent. But young people need more than financial support. They need a political voice. And that's why votes at 16 are at the centre of our campaigning for political reform. If it's okay to vote at 16 and 17 in Scotland, then it should be okay to vote at 16 and 17 in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And this is a reform that sits alongside proportional representation for Westminster, for English and Welsh local government, a fully elected House of Lords, reform of party funding, and radical decentralisation from central to local government. We have been and are the party of political reform. And in particular, we're the party of devolution. And we've proved how well it works. And I want to pay particular tribute to our campaign teams in Scotland for their advances under Willie Rennie. And to Kirsty Jobb for the great job she's doing as Welsh Education Secretary. But before we overhaul what is fundamentally a broken political system, we have to demonstrate that we can win under the existing system. And that means opening the way to many more Lib Dem councils and MPs by getting back at least to the national vote share we enjoyed before 2010. I believe it can be done. But it won't be done until we have a party that looks like modern Britain. Thanks to the efforts of party president Sal Brinton and others, progress has been made in improving gender balance, but it's still inadequate. I demonstrated in government a commitment to this issue by working in Women in Business to achieve a demanding target for women on the boards of top companies. And I'm committed to a similar ambition in our own party. To be frank, we've got even further to travel in ensuring that we have proper Black, Asian and minority representation at all levels. As many of you know, I married into an Asian family, and we brought up a multiracial family in this country. And my own family's flourished, but I'm perhaps more conscious than many of the subtle and often not so subtle barriers that still exist. And now we see an upsurge of xenophobia and racism, which many of us had dared to hope had been banished for good. So there's much to be done before we can call our country and our party successfully integrated. But I am optimistic. We believe in equality. We've demonstrated through the work of Lynn Featherstone and others on equal marriage that we can lead public opinion in a liberal direction. I'm optimistic too for our party. We've had several very difficult years since the formation of the coalition. But I know there's a great deal of resilience and energy and self-discipline in our party which will fuel our recovery. There are now big opportunities created by our distinctive and clear leadership of anti-Brexit opinion, and by the growing self-indulgent extremism in both the Conservatives and Labour parties. Now, I know you're impatient for success. I think the country's impatient for success. I'm impatient for success. But I know, too, the value of endurance. Success is often laced with setback. I reflect on one of the most difficult periods in my own life, when many of you will know that I lost my first wife, Olympia. In time, I recovered and I found a new partnership with Rachel, and she's sustained and supported me ever since. And her energy and dedication to me is the source of my energy and my dedication to this party. And politics has proved an even greater waiting game than life. I had to wait 30 years from my first campaign to win a seat in Parliament. And I've now had to wait 2 years to return after the setback in 2015. But now, friends, the time for waiting is over. Only the Liberal Democrats have the ideas, the experience, the commitment to transform the fortunes of our country. An exit from Brexit, a grown-up approach to the economy, and bold ideas to strengthen our society through the 21st century. I'm ready to take our message out to the country. And I ask you to join me on the journey as we together take the Liberal Democrats back to government. Thank you.